Danny, go ahead and introduce yourself and take off.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much, ASQ Section 1106, and special thanks to Duke Oaks, who connected with me on this topic for here today. My name is Danny Picciotti. I am currently the chair-elect of ASQ's board of directors. I'm also the president of QMS Alliance, a very small consulting company based in San Diego, California. Most of my career has been in supplier quality, hence the topic supplier risk management, because as our supply chains are growing through today and also expanding, not only domestically but internationally, supplier risk management is beyond a hot topic. It's almost becoming an imperative across companies, industries, and countries, especially in highly regulated industry, whether you're automotive, aerospace, pharmaceutical, biotech, medical device, and so on. Supplier risk management is becoming more and more of a regular and frequent conversation. So looking to share some thoughts and some tools in this short little presentation where we talk about risk management and supplier risk management as a strategy first, and then we'll talk about some tools. So we're going to look at it from a risk management framework that includes identification of risk. What is the risk in your supply base or with a supplier? How you can measure that risk, manage it, trying to reduce the impact or severity of the impact to you, and then how you can monitor that risk mitigation activities to see, if it is being effective or if updates or course corrections may be needed. So let's level set a little bit first. What is supplier risk? Supplier risk really takes on two different levels. There's the business risk, right? The exposure to your company or organization that could produce some type of loss, right? Lowered profits, lowered margins, failure to not only deliver to your customers, but fail to provide, your own compliance, whether it's to a regulatory agency or to your customers. So if you think of anything that can threaten your ability to achieve your organizational goals, and that includes reputational goals as well. And I'm sure we've all can think about suppliers that have tainted a customer's reputation out in that industry or even in the public market. Supplier risk, taking a little bit of a lower level of the business risk. When we think about suppliers specifically, there is an inherent risk in working with, connecting, or collaborating with the supplier in a contract or a purchase order, new product, or even an existing product, because there is that operational risk that the supplier may not be able to complete or comply with the requirements that you have on contract. Now, I will say there is the positive side of risk called opportunity. And opportunity doesn't have as much conversation because we're still, unfortunately, reacting to that negative part of risk, right? That negative impact, that consequence that a supplier may have on our business internally, and then ultimately our business with our own customers. So when we think about supplier risk, there's different aspects or perspectives of supplier risk, and we probably think about and talk about these things without even really knowing it. The first of which is strategic and financial risk. So many of the supply chain professionals, when they engage with a new supplier or maybe expand business with the current supplier, are really working to evaluate and in some cases investigate that financial health of that supplier. Will they be able to be financially stable throughout the life of our relationship in a contract or purchase order? Is there any risk? Whether it's a large business or small business, there is that financial risk to you as the customer, depending on the supplier you may be engaging with. Again, some of those hot new technologies, suppliers may unfortunately come and go. And then depending on even the age or maturity of a product or project, I should say, there may be suppliers who can't keep up with the latest technology to see that product through its full life cycle, which ultimately does impact yours as the customer's strategies for longevity, in a particular marketplace or with a particular product, which then also impacts your bottom line from a financial risk, from having to potentially find a new supplier or potentially be impacted in your own production operations. Oops. The contractual and legal risk. Every interaction, usually, I should say not every, but contractual regulations or contractual requirements with a supplier bind you legally, right? You've got delivery dates, quantities, compliance requirements, documentation, performance, etc. Non-compliance, anything from failures to delivery delays to potential regulatory issues, can face legal challenges. And unfortunately, we've seen some supplier issues with companies falsifying test data for raw materials or falsifying test data for the performance of their product. That certainly brings some legal implications, not only to you as the customer, but also to the industry itself. Thinking about the requirements in those purchase orders, those contracts, those statements of work. Are they clear and concise? Are they complete? Or are they open for interpretation? Could the supplier interpret a requirement different than your own expectations? Then we've got the operational risk. This is the day-to-day. These are the impacts to your production line that can certainly impact your own deliveries to your customers. Think about those rejections you may get at receiving inspection. Rejections or defects that you find or document in your own production activities, and then yikes, on those occasions that those defects could actually escape your system to your customers. What is the implication or consequence of those defects? From it's annoying to it's not a big deal, does not affect the function of the part, to something that could be considered catastrophic, potentially causing some type of injury or impact even to the environment, facilities, or other products around it. These kinds of disconnects, gaps in the process, or escapes from the supplier can cause anything from annoying delays in production to keeping safety stock to be able to recover from late deliveries, to the ultimate of line down. In some cases, the supplier's misdelivery or a quality issue could literally bring your production to a complete stop while you're awaiting or investigating that particular issue. And depending certainly on the criticality of the issue, certainly raises the sense of urgency to try to resolve and get back to normal operations. And then lastly is reputational risk. Think about those companies we may have seen in the news whose brand reputation has been tarnished by what's happened in the news. Think about, I think it was like within the last 10 years, the airbags on many different models of cars, to raw material test data falsifications by the mill itself in a different country. There's also social or environmental factors. Probably about 10, 15 years ago, I think it was Nike that got some social backlash for using international suppliers that may have had child labor. You've seen probably an increase in ethical codes of conduct, supplier codes of conduct from your customers to you, and probably even from you as a customer to your suppliers. Because depending on your industry, that backlash, that brand tarnishment could really impact the company itself and its longevity in the marketplace. So not to be sort of a doomsdayer here, but there's lots of risk out there in using suppliers, and depending on the criticality of the product, process, or service that you're getting from that supplier can indicate the level of risk that you could be facing should something disrupt that supplier, something get misinterpreted in a contract, etc. So we've talked about risk as a general concept. So let's talk about some ways that you can identify some of the risk that you may have within your supply base or even within an individual supplier. We're going to talk about something called a pest analysis, and that does not mean bugs. PEST stands for political, economic, social, and technological. It's a very interesting sort of risk identification tool, whether you're expanding operations in a particular region internationally, or whether you're looking to even expand certain things domestically. The world is changing all around us. This pest analysis is an interesting way to analyze the broader supplier environment or region. And this is more, I think, geography, where that supplier is engaged. So whether it's on another continent, in another state, or across the country, or north or south, and pick your continent. There are many things happening very quickly these days. And a pest analysis can be a great way to try to assemble some of those regional, think environmental risks related to that supplier. That could be ones you need to have a mitigation plan in place sooner than later, or maybe what I'll say is a deal breaker, that maybe that environment or region is not maybe appropriate for you to try to engage for business at this time. What's also a good element of the pest analysis is thinking about drivers of the market, right? So there are changes, whether it's the newest technology or something that is a more environmentally friendly. Also think of regulatory requirements that are changing. If you've heard the terms REACH and RoHS, those two were driven out of the European market, which certainly changed how a lot of industries were doing business and the types of products that they could use in their own production or manufacturing environments. And this could be current or potential if you're looking for a new product introduction or a new supplier in a different region. What could be those market drivers, those changes, political, economic, technological, or social? A pest analysis is meant to look at the big picture, not just within the supplier's four walls, but what's really happening in the community, in the country, whether you go community, county, state, country, around them, that could impede or possibly expand your interactions in that particular area. So I'll look at pest analysis as both negative and positive sides of risk, right? The negative impacting, but the positive being an opportunity. There may be opportunities in some areas, in some countries, more so than others, going beyond just the economic sort of low cost factor. So here's an example of a pest analysis. So on the political side, the government provides a 5,000 pound subsidy towards the purchase of electric cars, right? Electric vehicles are then exempt from any emissions tax. The government policy is to have 50% of cars powered by petrol in 5 years, trying to lower, right, the use or reliance on fossil fuels. In an economic perspective, the inflation rate is low, but it's likely to rise. That means the import duties are low on batteries at the moment, right? Electricity is inexpensive relative to other countries and is pretty stable. Social. Millennials want cleaner cars. There's a low range of vehicles. Sorry, low range of vehicles is off-putting to consumers. So there's a little, gee, how far can I go with this electric car kind of thing? There is a status associated with owning an electric car. Are you, sort of at the forefront? Are you the trendsetter? Right? People strive to be environmentally friendly. So many countries are really, looking to define green strategies or green energy strategies. And this could be one opportunity, and engaging with a supplier in a particular region could just do that for you. On the technological side, there's a lack of charging stations, or there's very slow, it's very slow to change. You're thinking of adding charging stations. Batteries are unlikely to charge more quickly for the foreseeable future. So think about what and where and what's happening in a particular market, potentially around a supplier in a particular region. These kinds of questions or topics can be of benefit when looking to expand in one particular region or other. So I was actually just teaching a class on supplier management for ASQ. And earlier today, we talked about the pest analysis. And believe it or not, someone actually during one of our breaks opened up Chat GPT and said, create a pest analysis for a supplier in pick a country. And within a few minutes, that Chat GPT kind of raised some questions or potential risks involved in that particular region. I thought, man, what a great use of technology to gather information instead of you spending hours searching on your search engine. Another great place to get some input of what might be happening in different regions is the US State Department or even the US Department of Commerce. There are some really good sort of status announcements or information, if you will, available on so many of our US governmental agency websites that can be a great input if you're looking to expand internationally or maybe expand within a particular region within a country. Not to mention all the news feeds that you could possibly get as well. But a pest analysis is a great way to look beyond the supplier's four walls, see what's happening in the area, and it's meant to be a collaborative type tool, more than just focus in quality, where you can get marketing, where you can get supply chain. Even environmental health and safety may have some information on different regions or different EH&S type regulations, from an international perspective. So where you think you might have a supplier or a new supplier coming on board in a different region, try to put a little pest analysis together and see if there's any risks regarding their overall operations, not just their transactional on your contract or purchase order. You can even look at geography as one, thinking of from an economic perspective, their geography, where they are located. Is it near metropolitan area? Will the cost of logistics, getting the parts to you, be impacted? What kind of seasons does that supplier have? Are they subject to flooding, hurricane, tsunami, excessive heat, whatever might be important to you? So we think about pest analysis and supplier risk management. Spots the opportunities, warns of threats or issues. We've got a lot of governmental actions and or directives related to connections with international suppliers. We can also see in the news today, lots of things are happening with some civil unrest throughout the globe. Pick your continent, if you will. This does help understand what you could face as a customer doing business in a particular region or area of a country. It's a way to give you some context to start developing that mitigation plan and or take advantage of opportunities. So this one low-cost country in Asia may have some increased tariffs or customs duties when another low-cost region, maybe in Central or South America, may not have those kinds of duties or tariffs. Looking for the opportunities that different regions may afford. Maybe there's a more business-friendly environments. So just thinking about what it could give you as an idea of what's happening in that particular area where you might be looking to invest with that supplier. If there's any direction of change, think demographics. Is there an aging population within that particular country which might make it hard to find sufficient workforce? Making that up a little bit. Is that particular country, have they had numerous strikes within any particular governmental agency or service? So in Europe, over like the last 5 years, that have been like transportation strikes or other, again, government agencies or services. So that could be a disruptor for you, or at least something to take into consideration. Helps avoid starting projects that may be likely to fail for things beyond your control. A change of leadership in a particular country, a tax reform or tax changes regarding foreign companies or business in general. Maybe the regulatory requirements for starting a new project might be more than you had anticipated, from permitting to even contractual relationships. It does, and I like this phrase here, breaks you free of unconscious assumptions, where you can actually go find data, information from reputable sources, whether it's a governmental agency webpage, trade journals, market studies, etc., to give you some data-based decision-making options. There's lots of information out there, and you can certainly verify and validate that through several different sources to ensure that what your gut feel is telling you may actually be right, or in some cases may actually show you that there are some different options available. So before I go on to measuring supplier risk, any questions or comments regarding our pest analysis? Feel free to put it in the chat or potentially raise your hand and we might be able to unmute you, not sure. Any questions on the pest analysis? Okay. Not seeing anything in the chat at the moment. So let's talk about measuring supplier risk. How can we kind of get a feel for what's the level of risk? Low, medium, or high? So here is a risk matrix that can give you an idea of how to define a supplier's risk and maybe your sense of urgency and to put in a mitigation plan. So a risk matrix is typically used during a supplier risk assessment. What kinds of issues, think negative, could occur in using the supplier? What are the consequences or impact of that risk, from late delivery to failures or rejections from our production line to our customer? Is this something that is cosmetic or is ancillary to, is it catastrophic, which could cause a financial impact from a line down to even injury to anyone that might be using that product? Then what's the likelihood of that thing actually happening? Is it possibly occasional, as in, 1 in 100 chance that it could actually happen? Or is this something that you've seen some level of frequency Maybe it happens, every 3 or 4 batches or every 4 or 5 months. It's not huge. It's not recurring as in every week or every month, but it does happen more often than not. So when you can think about those kinds of elements, you can kind of define your level of risk by the probability multiplied by, or you can add whichever you're feeling. It's usually likelihood multiplied by the consequence or the severity, if you will, to get what is that risk factor for you, that sense of urgency to possibly put in a risk mitigation plan. The colors, as you I'm sure have already ascertained, the red, big risk, something that could impact us severely. We need to develop a mitigation strategy. This is a single source supplier. If anything happens to them, we are severely impacted. We cannot ship. Our customers will get angry. Should we find a second source sooner than later? Something less urgent is this supplier has been consistently late, which then drives us to be late to our customers. Maybe we should start putting in a place to get some safety stock on hand. Have additional parts ready and available so their next late delivery doesn't really impact us. And then the green, that low urgency, really there's been no risk. We've had one late delivery, one rejection in the past year, but it was, nothing that was severely impacting us. So they're not on the top of the list that we need to go address now. So being able to define some of those typical risks within a supplier, or similarly within maybe a commodity group of suppliers. Where are the risks in my machine shops or in my electronic shops or maybe raw material suppliers? You can kind of group those and do a risk analysis or a risk matrix to see which suppliers in that commodity group, maybe that program or project, which suppliers may be of higher risk than others. So here's an example of a suppliers in a particular commodity group. Call it machine shops, because that's an easy visual to think about. When you look at the type of issues or risks, and you should list those, right? Are we talking financial risk, operational risk, brand or reputation risk? What is it that you're looking at? And then can you identify the specific risk? Late delivery, product quality failures, scandals or issues, financial stability, or some combination of all of those. Once you've listed the risks, then you can give that probability and impact and start putting those suppliers in that red, yellow, or green based on the data. Is it a low risk out of 1 and low impact out of 1? So then it would be down here in the lower green. But if you had a high probability, high impact, in the 4s and 5s, then you're up here in the red zone that says you may need to put some mitigation strategies in place for these suppliers sooner and way before you'd have to do anything with those that are in the low risk categories. So how would we use a risk matrix in supplier risk management? A great way to start listing and understanding what the risk is. We talk about risk, but what does that mean? So if you can list the risks, then you can understand how that risk would impact your organization. Late delivery, financial instability, product quality. What's the severity of the impact? Line down to something that's just annoying. Based on the risks that you've identified, it will kind of point you in the direction of what kind of mitigation strategies, mitigation plans may be most effective to try to reduce that risk to you as the customer. Buying safety stock, second sourcing a supplier, maybe moving out of a supplier altogether based on the high level of risk. So you can actually kind of study that supplier's risk based on a couple different factors. What is your demand volume? Are you in the tens, hundreds, or thousands? And do you vary that demand? Are you going from monthly to quarterly to annually? Are your purchase orders, if you will, increasing or decreasing in the volume that you're requesting from that supplier? Because that can certainly impact that risk that you've identified. The demand volume versus the supply chain risk, right? Is your demand volume high? You need more product. And is that supplier's risk, think capability and capacity? Can they handle it? Another driver that say maybe we need to spread out our deliveries with this supplier, or do we need to second source them? Supplier demand versus supplier risk. Are they that single or sole source? Are they key or pivotal to the industry? What is the risk to you as a company? Are they one of many suppliers, or again, only a few? Think about logistics routes. How do you get the parts from there to you? Are there options? Or based on the geography, there may be only a few routes to get those products to you as a customer. And those routes could certainly be impacted based on the time of year, other natural or environmental issues. In fact, something that's come up within the ISO world, I don't know how many of you have heard about this, but there was a decision back in February. I think it was called the London Directive, and the International Accreditation Forum that oversees things like all the ISO 9001 audits and things like that. They added 2 elements that as ISO 9001 auditor, I need to now verify with my clients is, has the organization considered climate change as an impact to the organization? And then has the organization considered climate change as an impact or interaction with your interested parties? So if you've listed suppliers as an interested party, some of those risks could be related to climate change, which could impact your logistics routes. If there is an overabundance of snow from a nor'easter in the Northeast during the winter, or an earthquake in Asia, to a hurricane in the Gulf. Those kinds of climate change events could, or environmental events could have an impact on that supplier risk to you as a customer. Also, what's nice about using a supplier risk matrix is that you can segment products, suppliers, think commodities, logistical routes, whether you're going from continent to continent, planes, boats, trains, trucks, whichever, and determine a mitigation strategy for that grouping or segmentation. Whether it's metallic product, electronic, suppliers in this particular region or country, or those that use boats, planes, trains, trucks, etc. A way to be able to focus your attention on a particular kind of risk category based on your segments and develop a mitigation plan for each. So how do we manage the risk, right? We've identified it. We've working to manage it a little bit. Managing supplier risk is a graded approach. If you think about your supply base as the pyramid, most organizations have kind of a segmented supplier categorizing or classification. Whether you realize it or not, you'll have some amount of critical suppliers, the oh my goodness, what they supply to us is so key. If we don't have it, we can't do our thing. Or based on the complexity or the cost, there's so much money involved, or this thing is so precise that we need to have extra oversight or monitoring. Then from there, you move into important, as in maybe you've got a few suppliers that can do this, but it's still a customized part. It's still a noticeably high cost. And any kind of failures or disruptions would certainly have an impact on our organization. Maybe not as big as critical, but certainly, more than your all the rest general suppliers. That could even be your catalog, industry standard parts. Low impact, low issues. So critical suppliers are by nature high risk. Your single sole sources, those that are the only qualified ones to make that product for you. Thinking about the next tier down, those important to your operations, acknowledging who those suppliers may be. They're not the maybe 10, 15% critical suppliers. Maybe they're that next sort of 15 to 20, 25%. You still need to pay attention to them, but because there could be an impact, but not so much of the constant oversight you would with your critical suppliers. The majority of suppliers fall into the general category. You rarely see issues from them as far as late deliveries or quality issues. The parts are low risk, and you've got many suppliers from which to choose. So if one supplier is potentially late, you can go and easily contract with someone else without any major disruption to your own operations. So if we look at the critical, important, and general, we kind of have our Pareto principle, right? That's the 20% of the issues, or maybe it's 80% of the issues come from 20% of our suppliers. The most critical will be the ones that have the highest risk and most likely the most issues that we need to deal with. And the trivial many, most likely, are issues that we don't even see repeated on any frequent basis. So, something to think about when we're looking at this graded approach to supplier risk. And this is a multi-function environment, not something that quality all by ourselves would do, bringing in supply chain, operations, even program management. You can assess risk looking at its cost, production as an impact to production, and the overall risk level. What kind of risk? Financial, operational, brand reputation, etc. When you look at it from a graded approach, those risks tend to become much clearer and thus easier for you to develop a risk mitigation plan. Oops, sorry about that. So we think about monitoring. If we're looking to monitor our efforts in managing supplier risk, we have the opportunity to try to get in front of or potentially identify that negative trend before it becomes an impact. Using late deliveries as an example, you can start seeing some patterns of late deliveries or even product quality issues before it becomes a major impact to your organization. It could be as simple as looking at how parts are packaged. Are you seeing damage? Damage from transit, damage internally, as in somehow these parts are not packaged the way they used to be. A couple of other leading indicators. If a supplier's increasing lead times, it used to be an 8-week lead time, now it's a 12 or 16-week lead time. What's happening? If they're starting to increase their prices, okay, outside of taking into account inflation, but if the prices all of a sudden are increasing, without really understanding or providing a justification, that could be an indication of risk. Something's happening internally, inefficiencies are happening that's driving their price up to you, the customer. So a great tool is the supplier scorecard. And would love to know, I don't know if you guys can raise your hand, but how many of your organizations have a supplier scorecard? Anyone care to share? Raise your hand. Does your company have like a scorecard to measure suppliers' performance? Okay, getting a few. All right. A scorecard is a great way to collect varying pieces of information about the supplier's performance to really give you some, I'll say, consistent input on your potential continued business with that supplier. It's a way to rate and rank. As long as you have that data consistently and can make sure that the data is accurate. So scorecard, right? We're trying to convey a level of performance. It is a way to tell the supplier how well they are meeting our expectations. How well is their compliance to our purchase order or contracts? How consistent is it? Usually it's got a bunch of metrics, right? On-time delivery, quality acceptance, maybe responsiveness. There may be a few even subjective ratings, customer service, if you will. But it is a way to gather what's important to us as a customer and provide that as feedback to the supplier. I mentioned kind of the classics, quality, delivery, cost. Some things you might hear the term purchase price variance, how their price has varied from PO to PO. Responsiveness could be anything from responsiveness to corrective actions to purchase order acknowledgments. And if it's important to you and you have the data, you can certainly assemble it into a metric that can actually be part of a supplier scorecard. And it's great visibility not only for you as a customer, but also, again, fabulous feedback to your supplier on how well they're meeting your expectations. Internally, it can be a great tool to assess the supplier's performance and impact to you as a customer. And maybe the next time you evaluate them, do you want to continue business with them based on their performance? Or do you may need to possibly consider an exit strategy if they're just not meeting your expectations for a prolonged period of time? So here's an example. And there are so many ways that you can do a scorecard, more than as many people are here on the Zoom call today. The typical categories are price, quality, and delivery. Throw in responsiveness as another option. What is gaining in popularity is a weighting of those typical categories to come up with a weighted score, not only for each of the categories, but then an overall weighted score for the supplier. So when I say weighted score, that you would multiply, a percentage or a rating number by a weighted factor to come up with the weighted score. So if quality is the most important thing, you may want to have quality weighted at like 40% of the supplier score. And then maybe delivery is the next one. So you want that as 35% of the supplier score. And then the remaining would be for price. So you would multiply any of those scores by that weighting factor that then rolls up into an overall weighted score for that supplier. A great way to show for those suppliers that are meeting your expectations, especially in quality, delivery, or price, how well they are doing in that area, because it's important to you as a customer. So thinking about supplier scorecards to monitor risk. I mentioned it's a supplier feedback mechanism. If your suppliers are certified to ISO 9001, 1345 for med device, AS 9100 for aerospace, and so on, if they're a certified supplier, they are looking for your feedback for their customer satisfaction. And what better way to provide that voice of the customer feedback than in a scorecard? It doesn't have to be every month or every quarter. It could even be just once a year that they can get an understanding of how they're meeting your expectations. It also gives you an opportunity to kind of rate and rank within that particular commodity or for that part, how well your suppliers are meeting your requirements across that commodity project or program. If they're all struggling, that could be a sign of there's something internal that you need to do to try to reduce some of that risk to your suppliers. If it's only one or two that are having issues, now you've got to focus for some mitigation plans with that supplier. Scorecards are a great way to even the playing field, standardize the process, consistent way to analyze over time your supplier's performance. You want to keep it apples to apples, not apples to oranges. If you use one criteria one quarter and a different criteria another quarter, then you really can't rate and rank the suppliers evenly or equally over time. Standardization and centralization. If you have more than one database or even more than one business unit that's doing scorecards, how can you centralize those into a single scorecard for that supplier, ensuring everyone is using the same data, the same criteria, the same metrics? It also helps, I'll say, relationship maintenance so that the supplier knows how they're performing across your organization. If you can be as standardized and centralized as you can. Think about data-backed insight to make decisions. It's a data-based opportunity for you as a customer to make decisions. Do we need more machine shops on the East Coast or West Coast? Do we have high-performing suppliers we want to give more work to because they've been high-performing? Do we need to start pulling some work away from a supplier that's just not meeting our requirements? Managing supply chain risk is a process. So let's put it all together. When, different risk management processes, different risk management tools, a tool to consider using is a pest analysis, especially if you're expanding into a new region or a new country, to look beyond the four walls of a supplier and see what's happening in the environment around them. You can measure the risk using a risk matrix. Risk matrix is not meant to be one and done. You do it maybe once a year, maybe once a quarter, maybe twice a year. So you can see if the risk is changing with any particular supplier or suppliers. Is your mitigation plan being successful and effective? You can manage the risk, classifying suppliers, critical, important, or general. Where do you need to spend your resources, your time, and your personnel managing which type of supplier? You should be managing the critical and the important suppliers with more time and resources, and not so much on the general suppliers. There's industry off the shelf. You've got plenty of suppliers from which to choose. Definitely a way to manage the risk and be more productive. Oops. And then lastly, a way to monitor the risk with a supplier scorecard. Even if it's something you don't send the suppliers on a regular basis, understanding the supplier's performance, especially for your internal functions, can help you make decisions on where to continue business, where to look to improve some suppliers in your supply base, or where to potentially exit a particular supplier. So with that, I open it up to any questions you may have. There are so many more tools, I realize we just covered a few, but any questions on the tools covered today, feel free, hit the chat box, raise your hand. Any questions or feedback?
I'm going to stop the recording.